Hi everyone and welcome to the tutorial. Today I'll be demonstrating how to join yarn together using magic knots. You can use this technique if you run out of yarn and need to attach more of the same yarn into your project, or you can use it to join different colours together and work interesting stripe patterns. The really nice thing about the magic knot is it eliminates the need to weave in any ends, and that can make projects, particularly scrap yarn ones, quicker and more enjoyable. There isn't a guarantee that the knots won't come undone, but they hold well if you make them securely, and I personally haven't run into trouble with them. I don't love using magic knots for joining yarn in knitting projects, as I feel that the flat and loose nature of knit fabrics means knots can pop through to the right side of your work easily, and you might be able to feel the knots, particularly if you're making something like stockinette stitch socks. But the texture of crochet fabrics tends to hide knots quite beautifully, so personally, crochet is my preferred craft to use with this technique. The essence of what we'll be doing is taking two ends of yarn and overhand knotting them onto each other. Then we pull the yarn so that the knots butt up against one another, and the tension each yarn is under holds everything in place. I've seen the magic knot worked in a few different ways, and today I'll show you two different options to choose from depending on what you prefer. These are the over, over, under, under version and the over, over, under, over version. Let's make sense of that and jump right into the demonstrations. The first thing I always need to do is lay out my yarns, and to remind myself how, I say to myself that I want to do the magic knot right, which means I lay out my pointer fingers like this with my right finger on top and left finger on the bottom. And this layout is exactly what I'll copy with my yarns. So I want the working yarn to go on top like my right finger was pointing, with the tail laid where my fingertip was. Then I take the new yarn I want to join and lay it out like my left finger so that the tail goes where my left fingertip was. Let's look at the over, over, under, under magic knot first. We'll start by taking each tail of yarn and placing it over the top of the opposite yarn. And then curl each tail back towards its own yarn like it's hopped over a fence. This is the over, over part of our knot. Now we'll take the tail of the top yarn and pass it under the same yarn. This is the first under of the technique. And then to complete a knot here, we need to bring the tail into the middle of this created loop from the front, then out again to the back. Next we work with the bottom yarn, and this tail is going to pass under itself as well, so that this is the second under of the technique. Then to complete a knot, we also bring the tail into the middle of the created loop from the front and out again to the back. So both yarns are passed over the other yarn. This was our over, over, and then both yarns pass under themselves for the under, under, and pass in and out of the created loops to form our knots. Now we'll pull each knot nice and tight, leaving a small tail in each instance. The final thing we'll do is pull carefully on the outside end of each yarn, and that will bring the knots towards each other. We lock them together as snugly as we can. Then trim the remaining tails nice and close to the knot so they're not visible in our final project, taking care not to snip our attached yarns. This version of a magic knot gives us a neat and flat appearance. The alternative version of this technique is the over, over, under, over version. Again, we lay out our yarns, and if I tell myself I want to do the magic knot right, this means right finger above left finger, then replicate this positioning with the two yarns. Just like before, we start this version with an over, over, so both tails need to pass over the opposite yarns. Then curl back towards themselves like so. The difference with this version is that though this top yarn tail will again pass under the same yarn before we finish the knot, the bottom yarn tail will instead pass over itself. And then to complete a knot, it needs to pass into the created loop from the back through to the front. Complete both knots by pulling them nice and tight. Pull on each outside end of yarn to bring the 2 knots together, then trim the remaining tails just like before. This version of the magic knot has a messier appearance than our first version, but this tail here is jammed in place by this knot, and the other tail is sort of jammed by this knot, which means it seems to hold everything in place quite securely. If your overhand knots do loosen up while you're pulling them together, just give them another tug so they don't come undone. You need to be particularly careful if you're trying to use woolen, spun or single ply yarns with this technique, as they tend to be a little fragile when you pull on them and they'll break really easily. So always pull the knots as tight as possible without snapping your yarn. And remember, the thicker the yarn you're using, the larger your resulting knot will be. Now this is just a bit of fun and completely optional, but if you're joining lots of scraps together using the magic knot technique, you could wind your combined yarn into a gobstopper ball. It requires a bit of time and effort to make one of these, but they look fantastic and are really joyful to work from. As I knot the scraps together that I want to use for my gobstopper ball, I like to transfer them onto something like a Swift, just to store the yarn and stop it from tangling. You can skip this if you'd like to gradually knot and wind your yarn into a ball, rather than knotting them all and then winding them all. When I have enough yarn joined together, I'll start winding with my hands until I have a small, evenly shaped ball. At the next colour change point, I hold the knot down on the ball with my thumb and pivot the direction of my winding, making sure the direction change is held in place by the first few wraps. Then I keep winding until I run out of that colour. And again, hold the next knot down on the ball to pivot the direction of my winding. Make sure you're always pivoting and winding evenly around the surface of the ball to get a nice shape. You'll end up with a gorgeous display of all your colour changes in one ready-to-use ball. Then you simply work from the Gobstopper ball following your pattern instructions as normal, just making sure that when you reach a knot, you don't let it pop through to the right side of your work. The yarn will stripe and make beautiful patterns in your project. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to give it a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future tutorials, and let me know which version of the magic knot is your favourite by leaving a comment below. Happy crafting, and I'll see you next time.